Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the webinar. We're so excited to have you today. My name is Taylor Ward, she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Education at Just Solutions. I'm calling in from Yucatán, also known as Fresno, California. Welcome to the Exploring Hydrogen, Water, and Environmental Justice webinar. A little bit about Just Solutions. Just Solutions identifies and promotes just solutions to climate change from Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, and frontline diasporas. We are broadening and deepening the understanding of equitable and effective policies and projects, and are fostering a national community of peer learning for frontline community-based organizations to elevate their solutions and replicate them across the country. Please feel free to add your name, your organization, and your location in the chat so everyone else can know who else is on the call with us today. The purpose of today's webinar is to review the impact of hydrogen technologies on water consumption and discuss the essential considerations for hydrogen infrastructure for environmental justice communities. This is part 2 of our hydrogen energy series, where we are exploring how hydrogen technologies impact environmental justice communities. You can learn more about our hydrogen energy environmental justice framework, technical reports, previous webinars, and more on our hydrogen resource landing page. We're going to drop the link for that in the chat. And if you have any questions throughout today's event, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and we will incorporate your questions into the Q&A period. And we're also live tweeting today. So if you want to follow along on Twitter to check out some of the highlights of today's event, please feel free to jump onto our Twitter page. Our name is @just_solutions_. So to introduce today's speakers, today you'll hear from Alejandra Lyons, a Chicana organizer from Los Lunas, New Mexico, and the coordinator for the New Mexico No Loss Solutions Coalition. Alejandra has worked on environmental justice-related topics such as food sovereignty, climate justice, water activism, and militarism over the last 7 years. She holds a master's in community and regional planning from the University of New Mexico, where she focused on environmental and land-based community planning issues. You'll also hear from Arjun Makajani, president of the Institute for Environmental and Energy Research. Arjun holds a PhD in engineering from UC Berkeley and is a recognized authority on energy and author of numerous reports and books on energy and environment-related issues. And we will hear from Tom Hirschbach, a project scientist at SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory and a policy fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. His interests span all areas of the energy transition, and his work ranges from basic science studies of water splitting catalysts to exploring the socio-technological context of the hydrogen economy and the future chemical refinery complex. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Tom and Arjun to get us started.
I guess, Tom, will you share the slides and I'll introduce us and we can go from there. Thank you. So I'm Arjun Makijani and with the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, and Tom and I have been doing this work for Just Solutions, and it's been reviewed by a research collaborative that Just Solutions organized, and we're very grateful to them. Some of you are probably on this call. So water was a special consideration in the preparation of our hydrogen report. I'll put the link to the full report, which has all aspects of hydrogen production, transportation, storage, use. But today we'll focus on just the water aspect. But first, I just want to walk you through our main findings and conclusions so you'll have a perspective on where the water issue is located. Thank you, Tom. Next. So, all right. So why hydrogen? Why are we now talking about hydrogen as an energy source? General findings. So I'll go through our main recommendations, main findings, and then Tom will do the water usage. So you can just scroll through this, Tom. It's fine. And then we'll have some conclusions. All right, next. Yeah, go ahead. So hydrogen, when used as an energy source at the point of use, doesn't emit greenhouse gases. That's why we're talking about it now, because we're worried about decarbonizing the energy system. But why are we not using it? Because if it's so good, well, it's made from other energy sources, so you have losses, mainly natural gas. There's a lot of CO2 emissions, so it's not really a decarbonized energy source today. And it's very expensive. It's just cheaper to burn the gas instead of lose part of the gas in making hydrogen, then burn that. It's now we're worried about decarbonization, so we're trying to figure out does hydrogen have a role and what role is it? So that's what our report. So hydrogen can be made with renewable energy, solar and wind. You can capture the CO2 and sequester it. So the claim, how well that's done is a different question, as you all know probably. And so in this particular talk, we're just going to focus on a small number of 3 different types of hydrogen. Gray, which is what is today. Hydrogen is mainly a chemical commodity today, so it's made 10 million tons in the United States, but mainly for petroleum refining and making ammonia for fertilizers and all that. So if you capture the CO2 from hydrogen and made with natural gas called blue hydrogen, so the carbon is sequestered, you still have methane leaks. And green hydrogen, if you make it with renewable electricity, in principle, you could have a zero emissions, zero CO2 emissions energy source. You could also make it with nuclear electricity to the same effect. Next. Okay, so these are our main findings of the overall report. So hydrogen is not a greenhouse gas when you burn it or use it as an energy source. The product is mainly water, and if you burn it, nitrogen oxides. But leaks of hydrogen do impact other greenhouse gases and create other greenhouse gases. So there is a climate impact of hydrogen. And our second, so you have to worry about what amount of hydrogen is leaking, and some will leak. Hydrogen is a small molecule and leaky. So how well can you capture the CO2 if you make it with natural gas? And even then, you're going to have methane leakage. Methane is the main constituent of natural gas, 96, 95%, something like that. And it leaks from the pipes. So you have warming from that. And then if you make it with green energy, you should not use existing solar, wind, whatever, or nuclear to make hydrogen, because that is already decarbonizing the things we're doing today. So you don't want to divert power, renewable power, to hydrogen, because it'll be replaced with fossil fuel power, and you'll have significant CO2 emissions. So that's called additionality. You want new or otherwise not used zero carbon sources to make hydrogen. Water intensity, we're going to hear about. It's a significant concern. It takes a lot of water to make hydrogen, any way you do it. And but green hydrogen can aid decarbonization in specific uses. Steel production, ammonia production, which happens today, can be with natural gas, can be replaced by green hydrogen. Methanol production, also chemical today. Seasonal energy storage. But hydrogen has environmental justice concerns, like all the materials that are used to make fuel cells and electrolyzers and so on. Okay, go on. Okay, our main recommendations is you have to take hydrogen leakage into account in considering its climate impact, which the Department of Energy doesn't do today. And Argonne National Lab's standard model, which goes into all the discounts and rebates and tax breaks and so on, also doesn't take it into account. And we should use the 20-year warming potential, not only for hydrogen, but also, so this is indirect warming potential, but it is it calculates the comparative warming of hydrogen with carbon dioxide. Also for 20-year for methane should be used next. And existing carbon-free nuclear electricity, whether nuclear or wind or solar, should not be diverted. No new hydrogen production from fossil fuel feedstock. So this is a very, very important recommendation for those of you involved with hydrogen hubs and so on. Integrate water equity, and you'll hear about that. Incentivize using curtailed renewables. So let me pause a moment on this. When you have a lot of solar and wind, it's intermittent, and in the spring and fall and during certain other times, even in the summer and winter, you're going to have surplus renewable electricity. Today, where there's a lot of renewable electricity, Texas, California, some of it is curtailed, and instead of curtailing it, which is basically you're not generating it, you're throwing it away, you could use that to make hydrogen. So that should be incentivized. And there are local and global environmental justice issues. We have a chapter on that in the report. And they should be addressed. Net system balance. So when you're displacing fossil fuels, you're reducing pollution, you're reducing fracking, you're reducing water pollution, you're reducing CO2. So there's a net system balance in terms of, so you're reducing some environmental justice impacts, you're increasing others. So there's local and global considerations. And that's it. Take it away, Tom.
Yes. All right. So we're going to turn it over to the water-specific issues relating to hydrogen after the sort of general intro. And before we dig into the actual numbers, I just want to spend a brief amount of time outlining the ways in which water plays a role for hydrogen production. The main one, or one of the more important ways that water comes into play when making hydrogen, is some of the water becomes part of hydrogen. And so what this means in case of green hydrogen, but also pink hydrogen, or really any type of hydrogen that is made by splitting water, is that you break water apart into a hydrogen, two hydrogens, and an oxygen molecule. And what that means is, like the atoms, the hydrogen atoms in water are rearranged to become hydrogen gas. And so for every hydrogen molecule that you make, you end up consuming one water molecule. Now, something similar happens when you make hydrogen from methane. So this would be with blue and gray hydrogen. Here we're breaking up one methane molecule and two water molecules to make four hydrogens. And so that means that for every one hydrogen molecule that you make, you end up consuming half a water molecule. And this first type of water use, so the water that becomes part of hydrogen, it's called stoichiometric water use. It's purely based on the chemistry of the reaction, and there's no way to really reduce this water use. And that's why it's one of the main components of water use for hydrogen. Now, in addition, for hydrogen that's made from natural gas, so the blue and gray hydrogen again, water is used to extract the natural gas. Especially fracking is very water intensive, and we accounted for this water use also when calculating the overall water use for hydrogen. In addition, water is used for cooling. Component of water use is that water is used to make electricity. And this is particularly important for thermoelectric sources of water. And that's kind of a word that it says my internet is unstable. Am I still coming through clear?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, great. So thermoelectric is a word that I kind of had to wrap my head around when Arjun said it for the first time. So I'm just going to explain it. Thermoelectric power is power sources that use heat to boil a bunch of water, right? So we're talking nuclear, natural gas, coal. These power plants use a lot of water. And I'm just going to spend one slide sort of explaining why this happens. So what you see here is sort of a scheme of a nuclear power plant. What happens in a nuclear power plant is you have a fuel that creates heat, and this heat gets transferred to water, which starts boiling, so you create steam, right? The steam travels to a turbine, it drives the turbine that then makes electricity. Afterwards, the steam is cooled down and recycled to take up heat again, and this cooling step is where you end up using a lot of water, right? Because the cooling happens with water, you take in water, the water gets heated up, some of the water is discharged, so back where it came from, but slightly warmer. And then some of the water is evaporated and it's lost to further use. And so something similar happens for natural gas and coal power plant, right? But this cooling step is where a lot of water is used. And then finally, before we get into the actual numbers, I want to make a brief distinction in types of water use, because it's kind of a crucial difference that doesn't always get emphasized enough. And basically the distinction I want to make is between water withdrawal and water consumption. Water withdrawal is all water that is taken from a source, from some body of water. So this is basically the total water input for hydrogen production. Water consumption then is the water that is withdrawn and then consumed. So you can't use it for anything else. It's not returned back to the source. So this can be water that is turned into hydrogen. This can be water that is evaporated during cooling, either during cooling the hydrogen setup or during cooling for thermoelectric electricity production, or water that is too contaminated to return to the source. And then, of course, you have water that is withdrawn but not consumed. So this is water that is unevaporated during cooling. So it's returned to the source, it's just slightly warmer. Or water that is discharged from water purification. This is also an important one. Both hydrogen that you make from methane and hydrogen that you make from water, they tend to require a pure water input stream. And when you purify the water, you end up producing a very pure stream and a slightly less pure stream, and that's typically discharged. Now, for the next 3 slides that are going to have some numbers, I'm going to just be talking about water consumption. So this is water that is not usable for anything else afterwards. And so in this next slide, I'm just going to show you how much water is consumed to make hydrogen using different production methods. And so that's a chart here. I know there are a lot of labels and columns here, and I promise to walk you through all of them. So what you see here on the y-axis, we have the water requirements in gallons to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And a kilogram of hydrogen is basically the energy equivalent of about 1 gallon of gasoline. So that's a good way to think about it. And so we map these water requirements for a lot of different ways to make hydrogen. Now, this first set of columns over here, they all correspond to making hydrogen from water using electricity. Now, we have so many different columns because even though the sort of foundational technology is the same, they all use different electricity sources. So we have wind electricity here, solar electricity. We have 3 types of nuclear electricity that correspond to 3 ways to cool nuclear reactors. And then we have grid electricity. And on the right, we have gray and blue hydrogen. That's hydrogen that you make by breaking apart methane. And what you see here is that each of these columns has a blue component to it. This is the water that is used to actually make the hydrogen. So water that is used in the sort of chemical process. And because the chemical process is the same for all these left bars, right, just splitting water, this blue bar is the same for all of them. And then you see a red bar on top of that. That is the water that is used for electricity production, right? And so you'll see here on the left, if you use wind electricity, you don't use any water when making the electricity because wind turbines don't use water. You use a little bit of water when you split water apart using solar electricity because you need some amount of water to clean solar panels. But by far the biggest water use for electricity is for these 3 nuclear power methods and for grid electricity. And this is because nuclear is a thermoelectric electricity method, and grid electricity uses a lot of coal, gas, and nuclear. So it's also a very water-intensive electricity method. And so for these 4, actually electricity production is the main source of water consumption. Then on the right here, we have our gray and our blue hydrogen. It uses some water in the actual chemical process and for a small amount of water for the electricity. Well, you'll see a yellow bar here too that corresponds to the water that you use to make natural gas. Both fracking and other types of natural gas extraction, we sort of used an average. And the main takeaway that I want to emphasize for these bars is if we compare green hydrogen on the left and blue hydrogen on the right, the water uses are fairly similar. And to sort of make this more concrete, I want to highlight one use case for hydrogen, which would be water use to fuel long distance trucking. And so what I'm showing you here is the water that is used in the fuel to drive a truck for either a diesel truck, a truck fueled by blue hydrogen, and a truck fueled by green hydrogen. The water use here, you can see in the red bars. We also calculated the emissions, which is the blue bars, and all of this is per mile that you're driving. Now, the first thing to note here is that the emissions, when you go from diesel to blue hydrogen, they go down a little bit. And when you go from blue to green hydrogen, they go down a lot because there are basically no emissions, at least in the way that we calculate this. What you'll also note is that the water used to make the fuel goes up. It about doubles when you go from diesel to blue to green hydrogen. I do need to emphasize that we underestimate probably the water use for diesel. That's the note that you see below here, because we didn't consider water that was consumed during petroleum refining for diesel production. Right. But basically, I think an important takeaway here is that if you use hydrogen to fuel a long distance truck, the emissions are way lower for green hydrogen, but the water use is roughly the same. And so this is one specific use case. And the final slide that I have before turning it back over to Arjun is then sort of an estimate of what happens to the total US water use when we if we hit Department of Energy hydrogen production targets. And so what you see here is the total US water consumption to make hydrogen if we meet these targets. So on the y-axis here, we have billions of gallons of hydrogen per year. We can compare that to how much water is used to make electricity, right? Again, through these thermoelectric methods or solar methods, basically the average electricity production in the US. And you see that currently we just use gray hydrogen, and we use about 33 billion gallons of hydrogen per year to do that. Now, if we go to 2030 and we meet the DOE target, we make about the same amount of hydrogen, but some of it is blue hydrogen, some of it is green hydrogen. And because those methods are more water intensive, water consumption goes up. And then when we go to 2040, production goes up, water use goes up, same for 2050. And then another interesting thing to highlight is the difference between meeting 2050 goals with blue and green hydrogen, or also using pink hydrogen, so the nuclear-based hydrogen. You see that if we include pink hydrogen, the water use goes up dramatically. And so the main takeaway from this figure is that meeting DOE hydrogen targets would increase overall water usage to a point that it's roughly a quarter to a third of what we currently use to make electricity production. And that's something to bear in mind moving forward. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Arjun for some final takeaways.
Yeah, just a little footnote on the previous chart. Can you go to the previous chart? So if you look at the 2050 blue-green and blue-green-pink, the difference between the two is just 10% coming from nuclear electricity. So even if you make a small amount of hydrogen, small fraction, 10% in this case, your water use will dramatically increase. This is assuming your nuclear power plants are located on freshwater sources. I think I put in a note, maybe not to everybody, but thermoelectric water can come from rivers, lakes, and also from the ocean. So this would apply if the water comes from freshwater sources, rivers, lakes, groundwater. Sometimes groundwater is also used. Thank you. So what were the big picture conclusions? So hydrogen can have potential benefits in some applications. It's a niche industry, decarbonization, long distance trucking. The industry would be steel, perhaps someday cement as well. In the long term, to meet some of the variability of solar and wind, today solar wind batteries is the best way. In the longer term, there are seasonal issues when you electrify heating. So seasonal energy storage using hydrogen could be an important application, but not in the near term. That would be more like 10 years from now. Hydrogen has drawbacks, leakage, diverting renewable from existing loads, which is very carbon intensive. Water usage can be important, and there are, of course, justice implications, indigenous rights. if you shut down thermal electricity, as we will do with coal and nuclear and natural gas, what's going to happen to that water? Are we just going to transfer it to making hydrogen, or consider the rights of indigenous communities and disadvantaged communities for other uses? So the water use considerations, I think, should be much bigger than indicated in present plans. Go on. Okay, so I think water rights and indigenous water rights should be factored in to this, especially in the western regions where, and south of the southwest, where water has become more scarce, and droughts and floods and more uncertain, but on average perhaps more scarce also. So this I think needs to be factored in as a major consideration in policy. It's not part of the tax credit considerations. It's not part of the rebates. It's not part, and I don't, to some extent, I think it was taken into account in the community considerations, but yeah, so I think the role of water needs to be much elevated, which is part of the reason we're doing this. And the Research Collaborative of Just Solutions had wanted us to put more, and so I want to thank them specially, because a lot of the detail on water came because they wanted that much more detail, and I think rightly so. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tom and Arjun. I'm going to pass it on to Alejandra to get us started. And let me share my screen for you.
Thanks, Tyler. While you queue up my quick presentation, I just wanted to reintroduce myself for those who may have joined. My name is Alejandria Lyons. I am the coalition coordinator for New Mexico No Fall Solutions, and our coalition was very fortunate to be a part of this Just Solutions collective research project. We were very excited because of the considerations of water, and because to this day, we are still fighting hydrogen on the front of water. So I will delve a bit into our coalition story and, what our experience has been, and, some lessons learned from the research. So next slide, please. So as Dr. Makajani mentioned, I really appreciate the consideration in the West, because this is who we are. This is us in New Mexico. We are land-based people. We are people that rely on our land and our water for subsistence, and that has been from time immemorial. Myself, I'm Chicana. my family, hailing from Mexico and this side of the border. And I am actually in Albuquerque, in unceded Tiwa territory. And this is us, man. I mean, if it wasn't for the cultural lifeways that were learned from the pueblos who settled along the Rio Grande, we wouldn't be here, right? So this is our water, is our lifeblood. And so I just wanted to paint this picture because, water rights are something that continue to be a big part of our work as environmentalists, because, there are compact agreements with the Rio Grande, also with Colorado, water sharing, it's like each year New Mexico has issues meeting its compact requirements to send water down to Texas and Mexico. So as we think about this energy transition, this is a big part of our work. So this is just kind of an image of, some Pueblo folks over near Nasequia and Nasequia cleaning, a farmer, just to show that this is where we come from, especially those in our coalition. Next slide. So our coalition, New Mexico No Fall Solutions, we have about 7 steering committee members that are all grassroots, land-based folks, and we came together to fight false solutions. And for us, this is kind of the list of false solutions, right? So of course, anything tied to the prolonging of fossil fuels, anything that is net zero and not real zero. But primarily our fight has been centered around hydrogen, because it has been such a threat in New Mexico, because our elected officials, namely our governor, has been a huge proponent of it, especially with her status being a part of the U.S. Climate Alliance. Next slide. And so we know that there was a lot of money in 2022 through the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's also the IRA, Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and we are all for clean jobs, but we mean real clean, right? And so New Mexico saw a big hydrogen hype, is to say, when these funds were put out into the public. Myself and some other coalition members, Julia Bernal, have been involved in the UNFCCC spaces, so the Conference of Parties, where our governor and a couple others have been there. And you can see even in those international spaces how hydrogen is promoted, right? Next slide. So our coalition formed more formally in 2022. Through our state legislative sessions, we saw many attempts to get hydrogen off the ground. There was about 7 different bills that were tabled because we questioned what it meant for this technology, because we didn't want New Mexico to be left with a bag. And we felt, especially with the conversations that were happening, around the Paris Climate Agreement and Article 6 and the okay of these sort of market mechanisms, as we could call them, meaning that these are like techno fixes to the climate crisis instead of looking at our actual emissions, real time. And so, without real community consideration, not just our coalition, but many others in New Mexico said no, because, a lot of the hydrogen at this time that was being proposed was exactly, that gray and blue hydrogen. So this was our first legislative session. And yeah, of course, public-private partnerships such as those with Biotech and Albuquerque, we've been monitoring these sort of things. Next slide. And this was where our coalition, I think, was really strong. So after defeating these different hydrogen proposals at the legislature, then surely after in 2022, we see this WISH Interstate Hydrogen Hub prop up, with the governors of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming coming together to put together this big proposal for a hydrogen economy in the West, primarily focusing on these public-private partnerships with groups such as Tallgrass and these huge projects, right? A lot of them fossil fuel based. There were some green hydrogen projects, but primarily, right, looking at New Mexico, because we have the Permian Basin, right? We are like one of the second, producers, the largest producer of oil and gas. And so we were very stunned of this and what this could mean for our state and crutching the fossil fuel industry. Next slide. So our coalition, again, worked really hard. We wrote a letter to the DOE, Secretary Granholm, Director Kane, and where we outlined a lot of the concerns that are, I think, part of the EJ framework that came out. We were concerned about dirty fossil fuels, the specific issue that New Mexico already has issues with contamination due to oil and gas spills, groundwater contamination that could happen with, the blue hydrogen, and our energy mineral resources department already has issues being in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? So this was one of the issues we put in this letter, and I believe Tyler will send that around with some of the materials as well as our presentation. But around this idea that this is clean, we are also very affected by drought in New Mexico. Each year, our farmers, that are our lifeblood, have to curb their farming, whatever that may be, and so each year we are losing more water due to aridification. And so this was another primary concern that we outlined in our letter to DOE. And the last point, I think, that is a big piece, which is the economic justice issue, right? We don't want New Mexico to be left with stranded assets, and we fought really hard to put out a narrative to talk about, hydrogen is, it has been around, but this form of hydrogen that is being proposed and funded so heavily by the federal government, we are concerned that, there's going to be progress over the next couple of years, and New Mexico will be another testing site because, New Mexico as a state has been deemed this energy sacrifice zone. And so we don't want to be the test state again for this other uncertain energy that would essentially, in our belief, keep us tied to fossil fuels. And so, in short, that was what some of our letter to Wish stated. Next slide. And this is just the news lines, headlines to just talk about, this is what the state of New Mexico looks like. We have discharges that happen daily in New Mexico. This is what an oil spill looks like. And of course, those oil spills, they affect our groundwater. And we see rules being passed to hold the oil and gas industry accountable, but they keep polluting. So we see this happening. Next slide. And this is happening alongside the fact that the Rio Grande, it dries up every year. We know that, some of this is a bit natural just because of the way that our dam system, or not natural, right? But that this happens. But even now in New Mexico, with these last couple snows we've had in February, now here in March as well, but the drought will continue. And this is something that we want our policy makers to keep in mind as we promote a resource for energy that would be very water intensive. Next slide. This is just a U.S. drought map. So this was taken this morning. But in the summer, I just want to show, we're usually at an exceptional drought. And this is like just after some snow that we recently got in New Mexico. The black outlined piece is where Albuquerque and Bernalillo County sits. But as you can see, especially in the Permian Basin and, especially in the summers, even in the Four Corners area near San Juan, we have exceptional drought all over the state. And so this is just after some precipitation. Next slide. So in 2023, we saw another attempt to get hydrogen off the ground. We saw them promoting things such as nuclear, right? And this is all part of the hydrogen picture because there have been a lot of political avenues to try to bring in the workforce, but they all essentially come back to false solutions as hydrogen, carbon capture, that would all be nested within this hydrogen economy. And so this is just our team doing some advocacy. As you can see, we did a billboard campaign with the hydrogen hype, and we have the Hindenburg just to show too, like the public health crisis that could ensue, thinking and considering the what we have in New Mexico with the issues already with our departments, not being able to be funded to do the work that they already need to do in monitoring this industry. This is just some photos of our coalition again at the 2023 legislative session. Next slide. And, despite defeating hydrogen once again, New Mexico was not granted Wish. And the governor said she is still committed to making hydrogen happen. We heard through the grapevine that, there was several reasons. There was a lot of community pushback. There was issues with the community benefits agreements. But when it comes to technology and water, these were big concerns of why, we believe that DOE did not fund the Wish H2 hub, right? So then, our politicians are just still at it. Next slide. So at COP28, our governor makes this big announcement that she will invest $500 million to treat fracking wastewater. And then later we find out this would include brackish water, building desalination treatments for new energy sources, industrial applications. And we already know what the writing on the wall is and why this is happening. Next slide. So, this is during the last legislative session that happened in January. Our crew was out to talk about some of the issues, not only with hydrogen and water use and trying to find this quote new water use, but there are issues already with produced water that I'm sure people are aware of. Contamination, what can we do with the waste? And the way in which we knew this was tied to the hydrogen economy is the picture up top of our governor was actually, this was near around the time that there was a press conference where our New Mexico Environment Department Secretary Kenny mentioned that, this new water, this new brackish water that would be converted as well as produced water could be used to supplement a hydrogen economy. They said it outright. And of course they, tried to say it will be green, but that we just don't have the capacity for that right now, I believe, in New Mexico. And so we began essentially this narrative war, and that's what our coalition continues to focus on. Tyler, can you go through the next couple slides? This is the 50-year water action plan that our governor announced. It goes a little bit into, just the ways that they hope to find new water for these energy resources. We can include this resource, but it outlines, this quote clean energy economy as laid out by DOE, advanced market commitments. And so, in New Mexico, even though WISH was not funded, they're still trying to make this happen. Next slide. So these efforts were tabled, luckily in our eyes. It was resurrected a couple times. But this just continues to attribute the commodification of water. And as Director of Pueblo Action Alliance, Julia Bernal states, the financialization of brackish and produced water. And, there's a lot of uncertainty what this means for water law, because as I mentioned, New Mexico, we are part of different compact agreements, and just not being able to meet those agreements currently, I mean, there's a huge threat in New Mexico is if these, hydrogen hubs were to continue at the smaller scale. Next slide. And so I think, the way in which our coalition has been successful is we continue to fight against false solutions. We continue to bring up some of this research that Tom and Arjun have done, as well with the Just Solutions Collective, because, there is this threat of purchasing water rights, calling it a commodity for a long time. Our grassroots environmental justice environmental justice communities have been fighting against the fact that water is seen as a commodity in the West. The separation of land and water after 1907, just before New Mexico became a state, is still a big piece of the argument, I think for a lot of us in New Mexico, because you cannot untie our water from the people and the land-based practices and the culture. And so we continue to fight this. Next slide, Tyler. This is just another example of some headlines of our environmental activists, fighting. And so in short, I think that we have learned a lot from this research project, because it gives us the data to show that our communities are correct in seeing hydrogen as a threat to our water resources and in turn our cultural lifeways. Last slide. So this is our contact information. We continue to stay vigilant against hydrogen of all colors, because I know that there is a discourse around green hydrogen, but for us in the West, in New Mexico, we continue to stay concerned because water is an element of life. And so, yeah, we continue.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Thank you to all of our presenters for sharing such great information. We have a lot of questions, so let's kind of dive into this Q&A. Let me pull them up. Awesome. So let's see, where do we want to start? So let's look at the Q&A box. Someone asks, can you explain, I think this is for Arjun or Tom, can you explain why converting wastewater, or it could be for Alejandro, sorry, can you explain why converting wastewater into recycled water for industry is considered a false solution? Anyone feel free to take that
I
one.
thought it was for Alejandra, which is why I didn't answer it.
I could give a stab. I mean, for us, we consider it a false solution because if the state specifically, like the state of New Mexico, is buying produced fracked water, toxic waste, it builds a reliance on fossil fuels. I mean, the fossil fuel industry has to be in existence for us to buy that fracked water, and try to figure out a way to use it. And also, the other thing I forgot to mention is, for New Mexico, it is in our I mean, the waters belong to the people. That is our water law. And so, I think that the politicians should listen to the folks when they're saying this is our water and we don't want to buy toxic fracking waste.
Yeah. So just to complement that a little bit, thank you, Alejandra. So Alejandra had asked us to look at this question of brackish water as we were preparing the report, Tom and I. So some of this is also discussed in our report. So the question of cleaning up produced water, when you clean up one stream, get cleaner water on the other stream, the residual stream is more toxic. So question of what are you going to do with that? Are you going to re-inject it in the ground? And what kind of differential impact are you going to have? So produced water is one question. The question with brackish water and in water stressed areas, cleaning up wastewater, whether it's municipal water, brackish water, desalination, all of these questions are going to be on the table because of climate change. The thing that we discussed at that time, if you'll remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong or compliment or amplify my answer, is if you're going to make more fresh potable water, what should be the priorities? Should it be for domestic consumption? Should it be for agriculture? Or should we be doing things like making hydrogen with it? And there are some uses of hydrogen that are important, but in the short term, it's really replacing natural gas and ammonia and methanol production. That's what should be done, and that's not in water-stressed areas mainly, like New Mexico. It's more in the Gulf Coast. But in the longer term, you could, and it is already being done, make purifying wastewater to make potable water, and you could make hydrogen with that. But the community has to decide what the priorities are. There's shortage of potable water, and you can't build housing because there's not enough water, as is the case in Arizona and possibly New Mexico, and certainly the case in Arizona. You have to take that into account before you cite a large hydrogen production plant. So it's not always like a bad idea to purify the water. It might be a good idea sometimes, and it is being done usefully to make more potable water, but it's a question of priorities. Where does hydrogen fit in?
Definitely. Thank you. And another question, the water that's contaminated through the process, does it pose a risk to health, and how is it disposed of?
I was a little puzzled by what process are we talking about?
I think
Could the
the
questioner
different,
clarify that?
yeah, I'm assuming through like the different hydrogen like consumption processes. Like if the water that's the wastewater that's produced.
Yeah, so when
How
you're
is that?
cleaning, when you're purifying water for hydrogen production, because you need pure water, there's a more contaminated stream. Sometimes it's just, Tom, you looked at this more. You want to take a first crack at it, and I will, if
Sure.
necessary.
Yeah, I mean, when we say contaminated, so let's say even drinking water, right, would be too contaminated for hydrogen production. What that means is that there are too many salts in there. So if you ever had like hard tap water, right, you can taste there's some calcium, magnesium, that kind of stuff in there. When you purify water for hydrogen production, you filter all of that out. So you're basically left with pure water. And so all of those salts, they end up in a more concentrated stream. And we did the math. I think sometimes it's like 50 or 25%, I forgot the exact number, more concentrated in those like dissolved solids. And so I think in that scenario, at least the assumption that even the GREET model from the Department of Energy uses is that you just return that to the source. I mean, obviously you can't do that indefinitely because then you're just going to end up concentrating your source water. But our initial estimates are that it might be okay to do. I'll let Arjun expand it.
So long as the amount of water is not large and the body in which, so, we purify water. So when you convert hard water to soft water, you're concentrating salt. It's not toxic because we drink water that has some of these salts in them. Some of them are even essential elements for us. So you don't want to drink distilled water, basically, I think. Not a biologist, but that's my understanding. So we're not necessarily talking about toxic elements like, toxic chemicals in the water. We're mostly this purification we talk about is purification to reduce the salt concentration. And so that, so long as it's small relative to the body of water we're discharging, and we purify it before it's put into potable water pipelines, it should be okay. But there is, like desalination, for example, is a very good example. You as extreme example, you desalinate water, you make potable water, but now you have a very salty stream to discharge, and this can, if you do a lot of this desalination, this can become a serious problem for ocean ecology. So, living with enough, so that whole kind of philosophical idea, where are we, why indigenous people, we should have been listening to them a long time ago more than we do, is becomes more and more important and more urgent, especially when you consider issues like this.
Thank you. Then we have a question. What can be taken from the analysis regarding best practices for siting hydrogen production regarding some of its end uses that will be narrowly needed?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really hard question. So easy to say where you shouldn't site large plants without extensive and determinative community involvement is where we know there's going to be water scarcity or from time to time extreme droughts. We can identify these areas, but that doesn't mean that it's easy elsewhere. So I'll give an example of the Southeast, which is not considered a water scarce area. Tim Judson is on the line. I know, correct me how long ago it was, Tim, you would know this. You have a better memory than me, I think. In the Southeast, so a lot of thermal generation, nuclear power plants, natural gas, coal-fired power plants in the Southeast, plenty of water, but there was a drought some years ago and we had to curtail generation. So what happens is there are competing uses for this water, and you might wind up curtailing your electricity generation because you're producing hydrogen, or your hydrogen production might become unreliable because now you don't have enough water to go around during a period of drought, even though on average you've got plenty. And so, and somebody was put up a note about the Great Lakes, plenty of water. The Great Lakes are among the largest bodies of fresh water in the world, but then you already got a salinity problem because you're using road salt, and there are many potential demands of what might happen to the Great Lakes. And as Tim Judson has said in the chat, nuclear has most often been curtailed due to high water temperatures. But also, I think at that time, wasn't it Georgia that it was curtailed due to water scarcity? Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, yeah. So it's a complicated question. The short answer to that question is, without consideration of the long-term and climate change and serious involvement of the community and computing uses, Large-scale hydrogen production should not be cited. Distributed hydrogen production, small amounts. Actually, Tom and I are researching that. We'll probably publish something about that soon. So stay tuned. Taylor will send it to everybody when we publish it.
I definitely will. Thank you for that. Great. We are approaching the end of our time, so I want to give all of you a chance to say maybe your final thoughts or a key takeaway you want folks on the call to walk away with, and then we'll wrap up. So I'll start with you, Alejandra.
Yeah, I mean, I think my key takeaway is definitely this discussion we're having here at the end, which is, how is the community involved in these sources of energy production, especially as, the federal government looks to international proposals such as hydrogen and these other market mechanisms. How is the community involved, and how are we looking at our consumption? I mean, this was a big debate that we had in the collective, and I hope folks, read the full report so, you can dive a bit deeper into that, because it is really a question of priorities. And I think that, it has to start at the grassroots level.
Tom?
Yeah, echoing all of that for sure. Maybe adding in addition to not just read the report, but also read the environmental justice framework that the research collaborative drew up. I think both reports go together really well. And I just want to underscore that this isn't just like a math problem of how, calculate number, emission goes down, but like we should really be engaging with all of these people that live where you're making these plans.
Yeah, my suggestion would be that we need to pressure the Department of Energy to take water considerations and environmental justice considerations and hydrogen climate impact and put them in the center of the hydrogen considerations, because today they're either barely considered or not considered. And so community benefit plan is not the same at all, because you can say, well, jobs, a lot of benefits, communities, 40% of the investment, we've done the Justice 40. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about serious environmental justice, adverse impacts, serious water considerations, serious climate impact from leaks. Today, we don't even have an accurate idea of how much hydrogen leaks at the levels of climate impact we're talking about, not large leaks for things when things blow up, but small leaks that have a climate impact. So there's a lot of work to be done. And, what is that? Larry David says, curb your enthusiasm. I think the DOE should take some lesson from that. And community involvement in these kind of things is very central. And, Tom and I have been, privileged to do some technical work for Just Solutions and for all of you. And we're here for you if you need us. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for your presentations and your time. Thank you to everyone for attending and sharing all of your thoughts. I will be collecting all the questions that didn't get answered, and hopefully we can do something in the future to make sure those questions get answered, because there's still a lot and this conversation still needs to continue. And so I put the post-event survey in the chat. If there are other questions that come to your mind, feel free to include that in the post-event survey, or any other events that might be helpful for your advocacy. Let us know in that survey so we can plan something that helps you in your work. And yeah, thank you all again. I hope you have a great rest of your day and the rest of your week, and I look forward to being in touch soon.